Okay, there we go. Your Excellencies, distinguished speakers, dear colleagues and friends, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to the Asser Institute, if only virtually, for this book launch of the Research Handbook on International Law and Cities. Also, on behalf of my dear friend and colleague, Professor Helmut Aust, joining us from Berlin, and Dr. Mihamsenko, our assistant editor. So, welcome. That was the gist of my opening remarks. It's great to see you, even though we look at the big screen, but we see many, many of you. A warm welcome in particular, of course, to our authors, the authors of the book, and we're delighted you can join virtually, and it has been a great pleasure working with you. I think the publication of the handbook comes at a good time for both academia and practice. When Helmut and I started to think about this handbook and to design it, cities was still a somewhat obscure research field. Today, we may observe that it has developed into a true force field in international law. This lively interest is not limited to international and law and governance scholarship. Cities are claiming an ever more prominent role in the everyday practice of international law and international institutions as well. Earlier this fall, UN Secretary General Guterres presented our common agenda to the General Assembly. And in this agenda, he calls for a stronger, more networked multilateralism in order for humanity not to break down, but rather to create breakthroughs to a better, more sustainable, peaceful future for people and planet. Cities and local governments are understood as stakeholders that need to take part in that networked multilateralism that is anchored in the United Nations. And indeed, the prominent role of cities and their regional and global networks was visible at COP26 in Glasgow. It only confirms how cities have become part of the international efforts to confront global challenges, and among these challenges, the global challenge of climate change. So Helmut and I considered the publication of the handbook an excellent occasion to come together and discuss how cities and their associations and transnational networks are reshaping global governance and international law. We are grateful. We are joined here today by 4 excellent speakers on the panel who will contribute to the discussion from different angles. Helmut will introduce these speakers later today. But first, we would like to start the evening by handing the book, Mr. Mayor, to the Mayor of The Hague, Jan van Zanen. In addition to being the Mayor of the City of Peace and Justice, the City of International Law and Justice, as The Hague likes to call itself, and for good reason, Jan van Zanen is President of the Dutch Local Government Association, VNG, and also co-president of the World Council of UCLG, United Cities and Local Governments, a global network of cities dealing with the issues we just mentioned. Now, this is the largest global network of cities, and so we couldn't think of a better candidate, a more suitable candidate to hand over this first copy of the Research Handbook. So, Mr. Mayor, here we go. Here it is. Thank you so much. Maybe it's nice also to have one with the screen. And then we have Helmut behind.
Yes.
As enters and
because Liesbeth Leidstad is not showing up. You understand? Yes. Yeah. But especially Helmut. Yes, how there's Mrs. Lanza. Yes, that's very.
Thank you. So, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Mayor, thank you so much for taking the time. I know it has been a very, very busy week for you, a busy day. Earlier today, you returned from Barcelona. Yesterday, I saw you all over Twitter, where there was a meeting of the UCLG. You were there as the executive bureau, a member of the executive bureau. So you're really living a lot of what this book is about, city networks, being part of global governance, being part of international institutions. So we very much look forward to some remarks you have agreed to give. That's wonderful. And some remarks about how you experience this development of the accelerating role of cities and how it is reshaping not perhaps only international governance, but also maybe the state. What is the value of these networks and how is it important to The Hague and to the people of The Hague? Thank you. The mic is yours.
Thank you so much.
To give. That's wonderful. And some remarks about how you experience this development of the accelerating role of cities and how it is reshaping not perhaps only international governance, but also maybe the state. What is the value of these networks and how is it important to The Hague and to the people of The Hague? Thank you. The mic is yours.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jan. And wonderful to meet you again and wonderful to see you all, although it's only virtual.
Some remarks about how you experience
this evening on this very special occasion, the book launch of the Handbook of International Law and Cities, almost 500 pages large, by Professor Helmut Aust and Professor Janne Nijman. And I'm also delighted that you have chosen The Hague, the city of peace and justice, for this launch, as I feel this book fits our world and challenges as a city perfectly. As is clear from your book, cities are at the forefront of many global issues, such as climate change, migration, inequality. We therefore cannot avoid to be experts on the impact of these issues on the ground. We need to play an important role in the implementation of solutions as many global issues require local action. And last but not least, The Hague houses over 425 NGOs and IOs who work on these issues on a daily basis and can help us improve our resilience and impact as a city. Global challenges affect us and require local action. And they also require collaboration. And in that sense, The Hague is not only a traditional large city with all the complex issues involved. Every day, 20,000 people in The Hague strive towards attaining a safer, more just world. They come to The Hague from all corners of the world to mutually try and resolve global issues. With, among others, the Peace Palace, the Humanity Hub, and also, of course, the Asser Institute at its core. At the same time, we participate in global networks of cities. And as Jan told you, this morning, very early, I returned from Barcelona. I visited the World Council, the annual World Council of UCLG, the World Organization of Local Governments, and their associations all over the world. And the VNG, the VNG, our association in the Netherlands of all the municipalities, 352 members, is very active within UCLG. Once a year, UCLG organizes its World Council, where over 300 representatives from local governments meet. This year's version was a hybrid one, with some members meeting in Barcelona and some online. And during such a World Council week, UCLG organizes different meetings on, for example, the budget, the work plan. And since 2019, I'm one of the co-presidents of the organization. And this also means that I take part in the UCLG presidency meeting and that I chair different meetings and ask special attention for topics which the VNG and the Dutch municipalities think important. Think of the Sustainable Development Goals, international cooperation, climate, change of the gender inequality. And I'm also, of course, involved in many formalities. And one of the subjects we have worked on with other cities is heat stress. There are several areas in The Hague where high temperatures in summer lead to heat stress. Reasons for this can be a lack of green areas and water, but also the quality of the housing. And within our network of 100 resilient cities, we exchange knowledge and best practices. And this led to information campaigns and colleagues from city executive distributing water to the elderly. And another example that I like to mention is cyber threats. Atlanta was attacked and had severe problems. And they're now coaching other cities in the network on how to defend yourself and themselves against such threats. So what is the value, you could say, what's the value of this, my investment in the international community and of my colleagues to do so? As I mentioned already, the impact of global challenges is always felt at a local level. You can't do anything as a UN if the locals don't support or don't agree or don't have a voice. Most cities operate in these networks for two reasons: knowledge sharing on the one hand and joint advocacy on the other hand. Because if we act together, our message coping with these challenges is stronger. Local issues clearly also have an international perspective, and therefore international relations between cities are important to learn from each other, to tackle global challenges together, and to send a signal to national governments and international organizations about the contributions that municipalities make every day to the international agendas they have signed. I mean, you look at city networks, you see strong leadership, mutual support, and knowledge exchange. By joining their voices, they're able to influence national governments and international organizations. And one concrete result, another one, of this has been the introduction of a Sustainable Development Goal, SDG 11, which is all about building resilient cities. And the city of The Hague is one of the about 100 global goals cities in the Netherlands, a movement coordinated by the Association of Dutch Municipalities, VNG. And a good example of useful exchange between cities arranged by UCLG were, for instance, the live learning experiences during the first months of the COVID pandemic. In these meetings, cities discussed the impact of COVID-19 on education, on mobility, on housing, public services, among many other themes. Very interesting and important, as we were dealing with very similar challenges, and everybody was new to it. I never experienced a pandemic before. These city networks claim a seat at the international table, and I think they rightly do so. Cities do already have a seat at the table of international organizations as advisors. The input of local and regional governments to the UN has been institutionalized through the Global Task Force of Local and Regional Governments, a network of all city networks coordinated by UCLG. And UCLG is an accredited partner of the UN and currently has a consultative status within UN meetings. However, the aim is to get a firmer seat at the table via an observer status. There is an increasing awareness that municipalities are not only implementation offices, but also political entities that operate very close to citizens. They are an important part of the multi-level governance system. Institutions such as the UN or the EU cannot deliver without the help of local government. And the rapid urbanization makes the need for cooperation even greater. Again, thank you very much for offering me this opportunity. Of course, the very important work that was made by both professors. And I really hope that with this text, with this meeting, with this enthusiasm and academia inspired work, also at the Instituut, we can collaborate and influence decision makers at the international and global level. And I'm keen to learn more about your insights and research in this book. I believe in public values. I've worked all my life in local government, and I'm a stranger to my family because they're all entrepreneurs, but I do it by heart and with love. And I believe that being local, and if you want to be an effective local leader, you have to be regional, you have to be European, you have to be international. Not because they know it's better, but for world peace, for care, for leaving no one behind and nowhere anyone behind. You need to know about each other. You can't be real local if you're not international. And if you are only international, where do you walk other than in some piece of land that's always local? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mayer, for sharing with us your recent experiences with UCLG, the value of networks, what they bring to you, to the city, sharing knowledge, sharing experience with these global challenges that hit the streets of our cities that you need to deal with, and also from those issues that you need to address, the claim to be present in international institutions, to be present at the UN, to provide insights of your experiences with the urban realities. Very good to know. I think this is a wonderful moment to invite the panelists on the speaker. Helmut will moderate the debate, and we have great guests. Before I go there, Helmut, let me one more time pay tribute to all our authors, the authors in the book that the mayor just welcomed, so to speak, into this world. They have written wonderful chapters on human rights and cities, on city networks and environmental protection, all kinds of different approaches to cities and global governance. There's Yisha Blank, who was here in a previous meeting in this room, giving a big lecture. Hey, Isha. Also supported by the city network, Jan, that you represent. And so it's wonderful to see you all here, all knowledge in the book. I want to pay tribute to that. And with that, thank you again so much, Mr. Mayor, for joining us today. And I hand over the mic to Helmut for the panel discussion, and I will join in a bit. Thanks.
Thank you, Janne, very much. And also thank you, Mr. Mayor, for this impressive insight from the practice of cities and local governments in this international realm. It's a great pleasure for me now to start to moderate the panel discussion that we are about to have, which has as its title, Cities and Their Networks, Reshaping Global Governance and International Law. And the idea behind this panel discussion is that we thought it appropriate to connect the world of scholarship with the world of practice, thereby contributing to a further dialogue between the work that we have done in the last couple of years in the handbook, and now to reach out again also to the real world and hear perspectives from experienced practitioners of the world of city networks and associations. I would like to briefly introduce the members of our panel, and I would like to start with Dr. Nila Akrimi, who is with us as a representative of VNG International. She holds a doctor in European law and has 20 years of experience in the fields of public administration reform, development, cooperation, and international contract management. And since, I believe, 2011, you're working with VNG International, both in the headquarters in the Netherlands, but also at a sister institution in Tunisia. So you are working in different contexts where cities and their networks are active. Also from the world of practice, we welcome Boris Tannhauser, who is a representative of Platformer, where he is an executive advisor. Platformer is a network of European, local and regional governments in the field of development cooperation. And it is a platform which is hosted by CEMR, the Council of European Municipalities and Regions, a very long-standing institution in the field of city networks. And we are very grateful that you are also able to join. Your academic background ranges from political science to international law. So welcome also to you. This brings me to academics on the panel, and I would like to first introduce Barbara Oman, who is with us here today. Barbara Oman is a professor of human rights law and also sociology of human rights at Utrecht University and at the beautiful University College Roosevelt in Middlesbrough. As Janne already indicated, we have a lot of authors here with us tonight, and Barbara has also contributed a chapter to the Research Handbook on the role that cities and their networks play in the field of migration, which connects with her work in this field in recent years. You have done a lot of work on the field of human rights cities, have co-edited a book on global urban justice, for example, which came out a couple of years ago, and have recently and are still running a project on cities of refuge. Last but not least on the panel, we have André Nolkemper, who is a professor of international law at the University of Amsterdam and also currently the dean of the law faculty. André Nolkemper, who was also previously president of the European Society of International Law, is working on many questions of international law, most notably in the last couple of years, the role of domestic courts, questions of state responsibility. You have been given the task to contribute from the perspective of a generalist international lawyer to this panel. And I would like to mention that it is also a particular pleasure for Janne and me that you are here on this panel, as you have been quite important in the process towards this book, because a long time ago, you introduced each other. You introduced Janne to me, and so we noticed that we were both working in the field thanks to an opening from you. And so we are very happy to have you here on this panel today to mark the outcome of this cooperation. Finally, before we start, I would also like to introduce Dr. Mihamsenko, who is with us, not as a panelist, but as our bridge between the panel and the virtual participants. Mihamsenko just completed his PhD on the role of the city as a discursive practice in international law and governance at the University of Amsterdam. So very much very topical PhD for tonight's session. And he was also the assistant editor for the handbook. And Jan and I are very grateful for the assistance you gave to us in this context. Now I am hearing an echo again, but I think it's already disappearing again. So in any case, Miha will connect us with the audience. There is the possibility to pose questions in the chat or also to express an interest to raise a question directly. The panelists, myself included, we do not see the chat. This is Miha's privilege, so we will turn to Miha from time to time to see what's going on there. But I already encourage everyone in the meeting to ask questions. If you would not like to speak, you can write them in the chat, but you can also express an interest to contribute directly to the debate. So without further ado, I would like to open the discussion, and I would like to start with the first question to Boris, who, as mentioned, is a representative of Platformer and the Council of European Municipalities and Regions. And you have also quite some experience in the field. And my question to you as a start for a conversation would be how you perceive the changing dynamics in the field. There is an ever-growing number of city networks. It is very hard to keep track what is going on. Networks form sister networks, they change their names, but there's really so much going on in the field. How do you perceive this dynamic? Does this dynamic lead to a change of global governance, which is driven by cities and their networks? What explains it? And also, how do you perceive more established actors in international law reacting to this development? Maybe you could share some first observations with us.
Thank you very much for the invitation and also for your question. I would maybe start with a bit of background, because this is, as you mentioned, the proliferation or new city networks that are being created. There's a rich background behind that, and the first real international network of cities was created as early as 1913, the International Union of Cities. So we have almost 100 years of history of city networks. Also the CMR, the Council of European Municipalities and Regions, was established already early after the war, Second World War, 1951. We celebrate 70 years of existence as a generalist network of representing cities and regions in Europe. Currently assembling 60 member associations from 40 European countries, representing over 100,000 local and regional governments in Europe. So we are basically the European section of the global network that was already mentioned by Jan van Zanen, United Cities and Local Governments, UCLG, that was created in 2004. So it took a long time until all the city networks around the globe finally reunited and created UCLG in 2004 as a global organization of cities. I think it's rather in the past 25, maybe 30 years where specialist networks of cities emerged. We saw, especially due to the progress of urbanization that we saw in the post-war era in Europe, and today urbanization is the major driver around the globe in the growth of cities and change in local governance structures. And so, for example, Eurocities in the 80s or different networks that started to address thematic questions have emerged in the past 20 or 15 years. I could mention ICLEI, a network of cities on the climate change, or C40, again, a network of cities discussing climate issues. We have networks on transport, networks on health, we have human rights cities networks, we have refugee cities networks. So we see this increased need for cities to go deep into the topic, to really exchange concrete information, to exchange how it works. If we speak, for example, about digitalization of cities, what does it mean? Where do you start? what should be the basis, how to safeguard all the governance questions that go around specialization of cities. So this is the trend that is emerging, especially due to growing complexity of today's world. So that's why these networks provide unique service. We, for example, as a Platforma network, have the mission to be the expertise hub on internalization of cities, on international action of cities and regions. And we, as a specialized network, provide cities with knowledge. We try to help them in awareness raising, in work with the citizen, in capacity building, training on specific issues, but also in advocacy and lobbying. That means making sure that legislation, that the legislative framework that exists around us, and that's domestic legislation, that's European legislation, but also global legal framework, go in line with the needs of the cities so that they respond to what needs to be done on the ground. Again, I would come back to what Jan van Zanen said, that global responsibility starts at the local level, and we as cities are aware of that. We're trying to contribute to the achievement of global policy objectives, which also brings together our mission or our interest to be involved in the creating of the policies, in the creating of the legal instruments, in actually being there when cities are discussed, being there where any topic that is relevant for cities, for the competencies is discussed. Of course, the global level, the process of adopting international or international law or international norms, that's a long process. But we have lots of experience, for example, as European networks of cities, as a general network of cities, where we really aim on, for example, the institutional recognition of the role of cities and regions. We can see, for example, in the Council of Europe, which due to the influence and lobbying of CMR created the Congress of Local Regional Authorities as a representative assembly of local governments. We can see it in the European Union, where again, thanks to lobbying of CMR and cities and regions, the Committee of the Regions was established as one of the institutions in the treaties. And very notably for us, very important issue on the legal levels is the European Charter of Local Self-Government. That is our international legal instrument, international treaty, adopted in 1985 by the Council of Europe. And it took 29 years until all the member states of the Council of Europe ratified this international treaty. So it's 29 years of ratification. Among the last countries to ratify were Andorra, Monaco, San Marino in between 2011 2014. And this is a legal instrument that we try to use as cities to also defend ourselves or in the dialogue with national governments, or we present it also as a success of European cities and regions at the global level. In terms of global governance, I will be probably quick because I don't want to take the all of the time, but what already has been mentioned, the Global Task Force of Cities and Regions, that's our presence at the international level, negotiating with the UN. But this all started already around 2030. The United Nations Advisory Committee on Local Authorities was created in 2000. And this is really the point where we started to be taken seriously at the international level, at the level of UN. And now cities are regularly invited or consulted in global policy discussions, global policy processes. And we see very clearly, for example, in major international frameworks that we need to follow, that we need to discuss, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and 17 Sustainable Development Goals, the Framework Convention on Climate Change with its COP meetings where we are present, the New Urban Agenda, very important in terms of the habitat process, the Conference on Housing and Sustainable Urban Development, Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, very important international legal framework, but also, for example, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda for Financing for Development. So these are our major international instruments that we follow and that we see overlap with the competencies, capacities, and needs for cities to develop, to cooperate, and work together for development.
Thank you, Boris. That was already very rich, and I think there's a lot of food for thought on the table. And I would be very eager to jump in immediately, but that's not my role now. My role is to be the moderator, and first would rather like to bring in the other panelists. And I would like to turn to Nila next, and in a way, maybe you can react to many things which Boris has already put on the table, as you are working for a city network, which is first of all working at the national level, but has international ambitions. And maybe you could present your thoughts on how this gradual rise of cities and their networks and global governance is seen from the perspective of such a national network of cities with international ambitions, and maybe also what your take is on why cities are embracing this international turn. Why do they go global to this growing extent?
Thanks a lot, Helmut, and thanks a lot, Boris, dear friend Boris. We swim in the same ocean, let's put it this way, as networks of municipalities, either at the European level or the global level. I think Boris has really mentioned the trends and mentioned also the evolution of the involvement of municipal movement or international movement, how it evolves into a recognized, dynamic and movement worldwide. Being myself a lawyer, studied law, and now practicing development work and at the local level, it's really interesting to see the reason, the why question, why municipalities are interested to be part of the international movement, why they need to be heard, and why they would like to be why do they want to have a seat at the table to discuss, to influence. This need actually was already very, very old, 1913, when this international municipal movement started. And then you have the First World War, the Second World War, and then the peace movement created also a need to create linkages at the local level. However, this recognition of the local level is unfortunately not something given, because it is part of a decision made at national level to embrace decentralization, embrace really transferring competences and transferring, capacities at the local level. So the local level really can behave as a full-fledged actor. So you see that every time there is some type of crisis worldwide, you see that the local level comes up as, or stand out as a possible part of the solution. We've seen that in different parts of history. And even recently, Mr. Van Zanen had mentioned also the question of climate resilience, but also migration and even terrorism. There's a lot of questions rising about what can local governments do. And even recently with COVID-19, which is the reason why we couldn't be together, also municipalities have been asked to play a role. So this recognition of the national level first to the subnational level to play a role is definitively a very vital condition, in a way, for the municipalities also to be able to play a role. And you notice that municipality who has had this type of space and capacity and power are the ones who are kind of engaging in international and also reaching out to other municipalities. We are talking now about the global south. We're talking about how can the richer municipalities or more advanced municipalities help the less fortunate municipalities. So there's this need for international, the international movement comes from the fact that municipalities are seen as part of solution to different crises. So there is a need for them to be recognized, and this need cannot be done as separate units. So to be created into networks has been recognized as a force, as power to be able to be influencing. So you notice a lot of networks around the world. UCLG is the global network, but there's so many other networks at the European level or international level. Cities Alliance, for example. There's also the Global Task Force, which is a network of local regional authorities specialized in climate, and they have been very active lobbying for COP26 and even after COP26 to make sure that things will keep running and the voice of municipalities is heard. So you see that this need to be able to recognize as such And Boris has mentioned that it's even recently that the United Nations, relatively recently, that the United Nations has recognized the municipal level or the local level as an important actor, because simply the municipalities are really shadowed by the nation states, because this is where you have really the multilateral system built about. And then when you notice how the trends are going on, the importance that local governments are taking, then these trends are definitively for functional reason, because there's a lobbying and advocacy for better role for local governments. It is helping some movements at national level to be able for them to be recognized. We see that in so many, for example, after the Arab Spring, so many municipalities and local communities would like to have decentralization in their system so they can be part of the solution for creating jobs, for economic development, etc. And then it influences the national level. So decentralization is decided by politicians, but implemented by policies at the end. And then you notice also that these municipalities sometimes, once this decentralization system has made, they become sometimes even in like game of power with the national. Till sometimes you can go to even radical, and I know I've been discussing with Jan recently about Benjamin Barbers and his ideas about the global parliament of mayors, about the crisis of the national state, about how the national state is unable to solve problems like migration or terrorism, and local governments are a real solution for that. So this crisis that we are noticing from the low point of view of the national state sometimes inspire either politicians, local, national level, or even networks, or even writers to explore what can the municipalities do, what role they can have to really reshape what you just mentioned in the title of this, reshape the international law in that level. So, however, as I said, this radical thinking is not always shared. National governments have always been seen as complementary to national government, the subnational and supranational level. They go together, and we see that also in all decentralization systems. It is not, it's a model of governance. It's not a political system, or it's not. There's different types, you know, of definition of states. Decentralization is part of the United States that you know distributes powers from the national to the local level. And this recognition from the local to the national level is quite a battle. And you see that in democratic countries, so the local level, they have much more space. The local democracy becomes a must. Elections on the local level are really important. And then once they have that legitimacy, and then laws and regulations that help them really implement and are capable to be reactive to the demands of the population, you really see the circle of democratic transition complete. And those municipalities are trying to influence internationally other spheres of political decision to create that space for democratic transition. This is also another need why networks are there, really for the purpose of pushing the agenda of democratic transition. I don't want to speak longer. Of course, I can go forever talking about this, but I think what is important maybe to mention at the end, and maybe I'm really open to answer questions later on, is that the questions about why local governments are really gathered, it's because it really, it fills a need, and the need is to be heard, recognized at the international level. But actually what is really the purpose is to be able to be recognized locally and to be able to make a difference. And the international level is definitively a possibility to create a lobbying and advocacy and support to that. And if you look at all those lobbying and advocacy policies, you see that from civil society organizations or from different stakeholders, the municipalities are seen like a level. So they are not seen as an actor, they're seen as a level, as a local level. And sometimes they can be confused with civil society, or confused sometimes even with the political parties, or sometimes within activist groups. However, what I see in Platforma or with UCLG, there's a real gathering around recognition of an institutional actor that could be embracing political parties, civil society, private sector, but in an inclusive manner. So it's an important puzzle that is needed to be recognized and given the space to be active in the international.
Thank you, Nila. also a very rich set of first comments, and I'm sure that there's also a lot in there which Barbara can immediately pick up on. Barbara is, as already mentioned, working at the intersection of international law, human rights law, and sociology. And you also combine, in a way, in some of your projects in the fields of refugee and migration, a scholarly role and the role of an activist. And I hope that this is okay to put it like this. You work in a field where there's a significant number of city networks, but it's also a field which is, of course, traditionally shaped very much by the nation state, migration, a question of the protection of refugees. So how do you encounter this tension, and also in the light of what Nila just said, of that there's this platform which is created? How is global governance in this field changed by these networks and these initiatives?
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Helmut. And let me just start by saying how wonderful it is to be here on a screen together and to see colleagues in South Africa and in Israel and in the US. I have good memories of our authors seminar in Berlin, where we were working on the book. This, in a way, is much more inclusive. And let me also start by, again, thanking our editors, which did such a good job in bringing us all together and hosting and inviting discussions on this theme. So let me indeed pick up where, on the same question as Nila, but then in relation to migration. I think Nila asked a really interesting and important question in theorizing why it is that local governments engage in all kinds of city networks. And as you just said, Helmut, I really came to the topic through an interest in migration and a concern also in 2015 about the way in which Europe was responding to the influx of refugees at the time. And there, in what happened at the time, in a way, a glimmer of hope or of positivism. And there, I'm not embarrassed to be an activist in the sense of seeing the hope in those cities and local authorities, which did really open up their doors, their gymnastic halls, etc., to people who were fleeing, who had to flee from their country. So this is how I and we started this Cities of Refuge research, really trying to understand why it is that certain local authorities in Europe welcome refugees, become cities of refuge, do their utmost to create a welcoming atmosphere, invoke international law in doing so, and why others don't do that. And in asking that question, we really stumbled upon the importance of city networks. Virtually every city that we started looking at was also part of this network. And another thing that we found as researchers was the enormous amount of those networks. So I remember in 2018, just wanting to do a survey of how many city networks on the theme of migration there were in Europe, and ending up with over 20 networks. So this, in a way, resulted in a research in which we specifically looked at all these networks, what they do, what function they serve. And on the basis of that research project, we came up with like 3 main functions and then all kinds of sub-functions. And the first, I think, was very much hinted at by the mayor already, and that is just the practical use of being in contact with other cities who also have thousands of people arriving at their stations, who also have to deal with people who don't speak the language, who are looking for a house, whilst people in the city also are looking for a house. So the practical advantages of exchanging ideas. Another clear function, if you wish, of city networks, and also a very practical one, is just being able to generate additional funding for these tasks. Often all throughout Europe, you see a discrepancy between the functions that cities have and the money they get for it, and definitely the ambitions. And this is very much where connecting to the European and the international sphere also really helps. And I also feel that this is part of the explanation for the spurning of city networks, the proliferation that Boris was speaking about, that sometimes it's good to go on with the same group by another name, simply also to assure and open up a new source of funding for the things that the cities collectively find important. So that's all really practical. That's a practical reason to join forces in terms of city networks. Another reason for joining forces, I think, is much more in the level of symbolism, discourse, the power of rhetoric, where I think the city networks also really posit another way of looking at migration, thinking about migration from often the national governments. And Helmut, you ask, what changes have you seen there over the years? And one of the things that struck me is, and has been striking me, is that first this was very much about the attitudes towards people that arrive in a given locality. And over time, local authorities have really taken up much more responsibility also for general humanitarianism. So the movement, a movement such as Seebrücke that you have in Germany at the moment, where local authorities are really, in a way, creating a bridge and taking responsibility, asserting responsibility for migrants whose lives are at stake at sea. That's really a shift that we've seen, and that's very much about telling an alternative story. I think you can also understand what city networks do in terms of really shaming maybe national governments for their position vis-a-vis international law. A third set of reasons, if you wish, and I think one that's most interesting for international lawyers, is the role of city networks, local government networks, because it's not all cities, in standard setting. So really pushing for standards, and in a way at two different levels, in two different ways. On the one hand, by claiming a seat at international negotiation tables. We've already heard a bit about that, and I well remember, and I describe in my chapter, the negotiations pertaining to the global compacts on migrants and refugees, where you really saw mayors gathered in Marrakesh to work out standards for refugee reception, and in the field of migration in general, also focusing on circular migration, putting other emphases than at the UN level, and really trying to get these emphases inserted in the global documents. So that's one thing, helping refine, set international standards. Another is also amongst participants in networks, developing own sets of standards. And we've already had examples of that in the table, on the table. One of the recent developments that I find really interesting is related to my former interest in human rights cities, where you there now within the EU context have a framework convention on human rights cities, which is about setting standards that human rights cities have to comply by, and also agreeing upon enforcement, monitoring mechanisms, etc. So all this, I think you can label as generative work, really developing standards and monitoring mechanisms. And this you find in the field of migration, as I've set out, but also in many other fields. So I think, yeah, you decided to write this book a few years ago, and I suppose even in this spate of 5 years, so much has happened in terms of the role of local authorities in international governance. And I hope I've illustrated a bit of this by means of the migration field.
Definitely, many thanks. And before we turn over to Andre, just a reminder that you can all ask questions in the chat or express an interest to ask a question, and we will soon bring that in. But first, I would like to pick that thread up on which you ended and ask Andre on his view. I mean, we have now heard a lot of we heard about a lot of developments, what is going on in the field of practice, how these networks operate, how they seek a seat at the table, how international organizations also partly rely on them. But then we still have traditionally a world of international law, which is a bit secluded for such practices. And my question to you would be, from the perspective of, if I may say so, a generalist international lawyer, does this matter? Do you see that there is an opening for these practices, or would you say that this can still be disregarded as some kind of low politics, which does not meet the threshold of serious international law?
Thank you, Helmut, for the question. Let me first of all say that I'm very happy that the initial making of the contact between you and Janne led to this wonderful volume. So I definitely keep this in mind when next time when I put two people in connection with each other. We put a very high threshold. And congratulations with the book. It's really a wonderful contribution to the scholarship on cities in international law. So on your question, let me make three quick points. So first, and that's a very traditional perspective, that if you look at international law as a set of rights and obligations and powers, I think indeed that much of this practice of cities is below the surface of international law. And that, of course, many of the day-to-day activities of cities in the field of refugees, environmental management, climate change, and so on, and social policy, and so on and so forth. Of course, they all relate to matters governed in one way or another by international law. But these rules of international law do not address themselves directly to cities. So one could say that by taking the view of international law to look at cities, one would take a too narrow perspective. But I would rather turn this around. So browsing through the book, through the various chapters, the enormous richness of the practice of cities, to me, they make the point that to understand properly how international law works, one has to take into account this wide variety of actors and the role of cities. So for me, this one takeaway from this volume is that it shows that international law is so much more than the narrow set of actors that actually have binding rights and obligations and powers and competences and so on and so forth. So that in itself is the richness of the book. Now, second point to make is that, again, starting from a traditional perspective, my first thought when I started to think about cities in international law was a bit what's new under the sun. So one can, of course, one sees the enormous focus now on climate change, of course, but many areas of environmental law, on water management, air pollution, nitrates, marine pollution from coastal areas, traditionally always hinged in their practical effect on the role of cities. Take the Hague, bordering the North Sea. Clearly, the treaty, the Convention on the Protection of the Marine Environment of the Northeast Atlantic, which imposes obligations on the Netherlands, in actual effect, for its actual effect, depends heavily on zoning measures adopted by the city of The Hague, by environmental management, by waste management rules adopted by the city of The Hague. So that has always been the case, by definition, I would say. So what we see now, this enormous trend that is displayed in the book, is not so much something new in terms of a phenomenon for the implementation of international law, but I think we have learned to take a different perspective. and to recognize the value of different actors. And once one adopts that lens, that perspective of cities, not as just implementing agencies, but as actors with their own voice, ambition, and that also drive the agenda, I think then the whole thing starts to shift. And then more and more cities actually started to jump on that new perspective of looking at their role, that there were more than just implementing agencies that they have always been. Okay, then my third point, and that's the most substantive point, I indeed think, and that was a bit leading from your question, that looking at the role of cities, one understands that the relationship between the international legal sphere and the domestic legal sphere is much, much more complex and rich than one traditionally in international law is led to assume. So in the introductory chapter, you and Janne write, rightly so, the traditional dictum that says that cities are state organs and as such bound by international law. But that really only scratches the surface of a very complex situation. At least let me make, and then I conclude, two subpoints here. One, I think it's too simple to say that cities are bound by international law and therefore are bound to implement it. This really, really depends on the nature of international obligations. Some obligations can be implemented, should be implemented by cities. Others really, by their very nature, by the formulation, by the structure in which they are embedded, require implementation through domestic law by the state. And cities have to take a backseat. That's one point. The other point is that, and that's the most important point, my most important takeaway from the book, that the role of cities in all these different domains shows that this cannot be grasped by looking only at binding obligations of cities. I think my guess is that the overwhelming majority of practice of cities is not done further to obligations that technically are imposed on the state, or rather cities assume a role, take a role in the implementation of a wider international agenda, contribute to the implementation, whether or not the obligations are binding on the city, and even, and here I think we are really entering important relevant terrain, even irrespective of whether the obligation as such is binding on the state. And the whole question of bindingness, non-bindingness is put in a different light if one looks at this very rich practice of states. And I saw that indeed at the introductory chapter quoted a footnote a piece that Janne and I wrote a long time, maybe 15 years ago by now, where we wrote that bypassing the issue of bindingness and simply adopting the values contained in non-binding international instruments as normative, as directive. So what one sees is that cities see and accept and recognize certain values enshrined in international documents, whether binding or not, on the state, and actively promote their application and thereby also their further development. And that definitely makes that this whole volume sheds light on a very fundamental transformation within the bounds of traditional international law. So much for now, Helmut.
Thank you. Well, at least I can say that, but I think that Janne agrees. I think we feel very well understood by these remarks. And if anything, maybe also this question of bindingness, on which we could have a whole separate seminar, is something which is at least irritating us as international lawyers when we all of a sudden think about these practices, and it makes us less secure maybe and less sure of what we're actually doing. Also, in light of the time, I suggest that we kind of combine two exercises now. I'd first like to briefly ask Mia whether we have already some questions in the chat. Are these direct interventions, or are you going to bring them in? And maybe we can then combine around with answers to these questions, also with reactions to each other on the panel, so that the important points which we have said so far are not lost. But first, let's turn it over to Mia to hear what's going on there in the virtual world.
Yeah,
which we all are.
Thank you for giving me the word. It was exceptional and thought-provoking to listen to all of you, both practitioners and academics. Really interesting debate so far. So I'll start by 2 questions. One was sent by Lena from New Haven currently. And what she's asking is a question directly to Barbara Oman. So she says, there were so many actors involved in the GCM drafting and negotiation process besides city actors such as NGOs, parliamentarians, academics. So the question is, how can we measure how significant the impact of mayors really was? Are there any objectives in the GCM where this is particularly visible? So this is the first question. The second question is from Scott Cassingham, who is asking, can cities play a role in the governance and settlement of outer space? International law and treaty creates a different, so this is, I guess, for whoever wants to read it, maybe the generalist Andre could answer this. International law and treaty creates a different context of Earth, and that it prohibits national appropriation of territory on the Moon, Mars, etc. So could settlements, say the European Moon Village, be conceptualized and institutionalized as a city with its own international standing to fit within this treaty structure? This is the second question. And I do have a few others as well, so I'll just share them. The first 2 are for Boris and Neila, and maybe you could both answer them as practitioners. And so one for Boris, the first one would be, is there any competition between city networks going on in the background? So we heard about this proliferation, but everything seems so tranquil and merry. What about the competition? What about the overlap? What about the dynamics that are happening in this space that's been created by city networks? And the second question is, it's kind of similar, but takes a different angle. So municipal governments are emerging as actors within international and global governance that is anything but cohesive and tranquil. In other words, municipal governments and their networks are emerging as political actors. In your work, have you already encountered the conflicting nature of this emerging role? That is something that maybe both of you could reflect on, not just Boris. Another question that is for Neila is, often in the literature, or sometimes, not often, sometimes, one can read that there is a fear of one-directionness of communication between cities of the global north and the global south, which means that it can create a tier of teachers and a tier of listeners. So could you explore this issue, if it is an issue or not? And the second part of this question is the fear that there is a lack of radical ideas in what is going on in the networks, meaning that often one doesn't hear much about the global redistribution or global exclusion and all those things that maybe the more radical voices, activists, NGOs put on the table, but in these global networks, one doesn't hear that quite often. So if you could reflect on that as well. One question is for Barbara as well. Cities and international human rights law. Is this an evolution or is it a revolution? Is it a linear progression, or is it change that can possibly retract, can go in the other direction? Maybe if you could comment on this a bit. So this is all for now.
Okay, great. Thanks. That's very rich already. And as mentioned, please feel also free to react to other contributions from the panel, but also try to be concise so that we can have maybe another round of questions later on. And I suggest we have the same order also to give Andre time to think about the space question. No pressure here. Boris, would you like to start?
Okay, I can start specifically on the 2 questions about the dynamics in the city networks and the political nature or conflicts. So we must start really from the premise that cities are political entities. They are governed by politicians who are elected, So there is a democratic element in the political governance at the local level, but at the same time, there is a political element. So city networks maneuver mostly between the technical nature of the content, of the knowledge, of the processes that we follow in terms of capacity building, in terms of advocacy, but also with the political nature of our networks. At one hand, this is, we take it as an advantage because we have a voice with a democratic mandate. That's not the same for other types of institutions, for civil society organizations or business associations. We really do base our let's say, legitimacy on the fact that our representatives are politicians who have an electoral democratic mandate at the local level or regional level. So this is very important for us, but at the same time, this contributes to political dynamics in city networks, in cities in general. So these two aspects probably go hand in hand together in terms of, let's say, political dialogue and discourse. But at the same time, city networks or local government networks very often specialize. So the gap from the political level or political layer of governance is quite separated from the content, from what we do, where we really work on the content, really work on concrete examples, methodologies, initiatives, etc., etc. So this is roughly the dynamics within the city networks. It's very difficult to say that we compete against each other because in the end, and it happens more and more often, different city networks actually have joint political statements or have joint representatives sent to the table for the discussions. So we've learned how to work together because we understand that we have the same goals. The situation in many cities is similar. The competencies of the local level are very similar, not only in Europe, but also at the global level. The problems are very similar. So it's very easy to actually talk about the real merits of the things rather than other types of dynamics. So I think that would be my answer to these questions.
Lila, would you like to continue?
Yes, with pleasure. I would like to answer. I want to comment a little bit on something you said, Helmut, and I just wanted to start from there to discuss a little bit this question. When you just asked the question to André and you said the low politics. Sometimes when we discuss about local governments, it's really funny when some also countries in Europe, they do describe that differently. Like the French would say it's the lowest level of government, while the Netherlands, they would tell you it's the first level of government, because in the Netherlands, because it's the most proximate to the population, while in the France, it's because very formalistic way, l'État-nation and then regions, and then you go down to the municipalities. And this is actually in the heart of what international network is about. It is not political as the comment was, or the question was raised. It's not political in the narrow understanding of politics, but it's political in terms of policy and advocacy and gathering organizations at local level, sometimes municipalities, but sometimes also local government association, but sometimes even regions, like there's some regions in Florence or regions in Italy were gathered, or in Spain, that also acting as a regional level of authority. So this political advocacy aspect is what really is driving. So it's not really politics in terms of left wing or right wing, but sometimes it's interesting that all the different political parties that gather around importance role of the voice of the local government. And the other question about the competition, Barbara mentioned something about funding. Let's put it this way. Most of the time, local government networks, they do meet on a common ground of being recognized and having the space to influence. However, sometimes the race for funds create a bit of tensions. And we see that with regard to Brussels sometimes, or regard to some funding from world organizations. However, it is not a level of competition that breaks the solidarity. It is a healthy competition what we notice now, that networks are going specialized. We have one global network with the UCLG, but we have different networks with a specificity that helps a little bit, diminish a bit the tension around some competition around funding. The question that was asked to me about the global south, the global north, and teachers versus students, that's interesting about networks of local governments. There's no teachers and there's no students, because I've been a diplomat at the national level before, and I know how tricky sometimes discussing some subjects at the national level when you have really like the diplomacy at the national level. But when you talk diplomacy at the local level, municipalities discussing waste management or how they will relaunch economy and social policies after COVID-19, even if they don't speak the same languages, even if they belong to different type of level of development, these exchanges fruitful on both sides. I recall some municipalities from the global north learning some lessons from the global south, how they deal with scarcity of resources, and which is sometimes in financial crisis of the north, the global north is useful. What I noticed in all those traveling between networks and seeing these networks is that the attitude and the mindset is not about teaching, it's about really sharing knowledge. It's about really how can we learn from each other, and there is a common language for that. The role of local governments, when it comes also to how law or international law will embrace it, I think I would definitely agree with Andre, and I'm really happy. I didn't have a chance to read the book, but I would definitely read it from the first letter to the last letter, because what's really important to see that we as practitioners, we are dealing with international instruments. There is a memorandum of understanding signed between local governments worldwide. There is a memorandum of understanding and international contracts between national government, local governments. So we've seen it happening. And the question is how adaptive international law to recognize this and to make sure it's part of the new definition of international law. A couple of years ago, BNG International organized a big congress on city diplomacy. And that was a big question asked. Sometimes the question is how dare local government talk about diplomacy? It's not something that local government embrace. Diplomacy is supposed to be for national governments. And however, city diplomacy exists even from old, ages. We call all of us the jumelage or the twinning and those cultural dialogues between cities. So it is all about the angle how we look at it. And this is also me joining this analysis that I understood came out from your book, is that seeing all all those nuances of grays or different colors of the role of local governments and how it is perceived as an actor shaping international law, and recognizing that is, I think, the biggest step. And later on, shaping it and seeing how it takes shape, it's something that we can all work together on it as practitioners, but also as academia.
Thank you very much, Barbara.
Yeah, two very good questions. One on the impact of local authorities on the Global Compact, and the other on evolution and revolution. Let me start with the impact of local authority action on the Global Compact. Of course, this is very difficult to assess. I must say, and I recount this in the book, that in a way, being in the world of local authority network meetings and then being at UN meetings, it's two different things. If you go to mayors meetings, you think, well, these are the people who rule the world, as Benjamin Barber would say. And then if you go to a UN meeting, there's often like a tent, a space for side events, and you have all kinds of organizations, faith-based NGOs, etc. And then there's also the representatives of the local authorities, which indeed then go by the header of other organizations. Now, what does the dialogue lead to? Again, I find it difficult to assess. One thing is that it's very much a dialogue, as a sidestep to Miha's work on the right to the city. I think there you see, and that's a book I'd also recommend everyone to read how the whole idea of the right to the city was developed in a to and fro between UN Habitat, international organizations, and local government organizations such as UCLG. So I think what was more important about the Global Compact is this idea of claiming a seat at the table to talk along on these matters. And if you try to assess whether this has worked, I must say I'm not so certain, not in the field of migration. If I see what happened in follow-up conferences, if I see the plans for the review conference on the Global Compact 2022, there's talk of listening to local authorities, having a whole of government approach, making sure that NGOs and local authorities as one group have enough space, but the real opening up that was called for, I see much less of that. The evolution and revolution question is the rise of human rights cities. Should we see that as an evolution or a revolution? If I'd have to choose, if I'd have to put my hat on one of the two, I would see it more as evolution. I really think in the development of international human rights law, more and more actors have entered the legal field. More and more human rights have been stipulated, and this all comes together in what you see happening in human rights cities piecemeal, with some trailblazers, some following, and many local authorities that don't work with human rights at all. Of course, this is all looking through a legal lens, a human rights law lens. I think it is important to acknowledge, as we've done throughout, that local authorities were involved in realizing rights long before nation states even came into existence. So lots of this is not about a radical newness, but in a way of something that was there all along, or maybe even a return to certain practices where it comes to urban citizenship. So maybe that's as a final note.
Thank you. Also, for this reason, we have a set of historical chapters in the handbook, which try also to give some historical depth to this issue. Andre, now the space question, but also anything else you would like?
No, thanks, Helmut, for giving me a bit of time to reflect on this exciting question. So this is a very intriguing question, actually. So my first take was, I would say something on whether existing cities actually have the power and the clout to make something happen in space. But of course, the more interesting question is, once one starts to think about the movement of people and the trend to have people live in some form in space, which is not entirely science fiction, as we all know. I mean, it is, but it's also something what we can imagine. Then in the question of governance of such entities, so think of a very enlarged form of the International Space Station with loads of people living there. Now, the two ways to think about this: one way is to think that the current state system would project their power and their governance and the politics to such stations. But the more interesting one is that a governance system would emerge outside the current state system. That certainly might happen if private initiatives of the type we're currently seeing might lead to large space station habitats in outer space on the moon or Mars or wherever, and people would start living there. Then actually would start building systems of governance which would be cities, right? The traditional definition of a city is a place where a given population lives under the same government. And then the whole international system might be back to square one, because as we know, the current international system started at one point with city-states in Italy and all that, and Asia. So then you could envisage very well governance systems to be named cities outside the current state system, and we would start an entirely new, perhaps circular chapter. Definitely something for a next book, Helmut.
We will consider it for the second edition if there will be one. We know that we can give the chapter to you now, so we will get back to you on this. Time is flying, and I suggest that we bring two sets of issues to the table and combine that with a final round before Janne comes in with some concluding observations, as we cannot keep you too long on this Wednesday evening. It's a different time for some of you somewhere else, but it is already evening in Europe. And I would like to ask Boris and Barbara for some reflections on the allegedly progressive side of cities doing all this. It is often taken for granted that this is a good development and that cities move global governance in the right direction. And maybe you could reflect a bit on potential negative sides of that, who is left out, who is not represented. How do you envisage that also in your practical work, maybe, Boris? And the other question I would put to Nila and Andre, and this would also concern the reaction of the established system, so to speak. How do you experience that when you work as a practitioner in BNG International, or also as an international law professor advising the Dutch government frequently on questions of international law? Do you see that there is pushback, that states become maybe there's now something going on here. So do you see some pushback from the established state system? That's the question. And you could combine this with some final remarks, as we're already running close to the end of the time. And then afterwards, we hand this to Janne. And for this round, I would actually suggest we start the other way around. So maybe Andre, you go first, and then Nila, Barbara, and Boris. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Helmut. Okay, two quick thoughts on this question. So I think there are two dimensions. One is that their roles really are complementary, and that states in many situations rely on and are supported by cities taking an active role. So take the whole sphere of economic, social, cultural rights, which are obligations of best effort. So states have to make an effort to get there, but they definitely cannot do that alone. They definitely are supported by cities taking a proactive role, and that helps actually states to achieve their obligations. So that complementarity is quite key. But at the same time, one can easily see examples at various places in the book when there might be slightly more tension, where states might be reluctant to assume particular obligations for many reasons, political, economic, or otherwise, and where cities take the position that states are too reluctant, and the cities move on their own agenda forward with giving effect and promoting particular policies. For instance, in the Netherlands, we have a whole discussion on handling and accommodation of refugees in the tension between the central government and local government. So there you see a friction developing, which is a bit uneasy for the traditional system. So an inclination might be that, well, then the state has to enforce their own powers centrally, but this is not the way as often plays out. I think what we rather see is that in that friction, you see a new development emerging, where also states might have to change, might have to adjust their position, and the powers of cities really are brought to bear on states that have to recognize the independent power, role, and even legitimacy of local government in furthering these agendas. So far.
Thank you. Nila?
I think, you can see that on different level. In the same state, the national government and the local government. In the Netherlands, we consider national government and local government as partners. We even have a say to go the stairs up together and to go the stairs down together. So this feeling of partnership that also gives a space for local governments to also be able to have their voice at the international level. In other cases, when this relation is not a partnership, when the state, the national level consider themselves as tutors, or as responsible, or as masters of the voices of the local level, so you have limitation of the participation of local government in the international movement, put it this way. So I really link this acceptance of the local governments on the space they have in their own, sphere, their own national relation with national governments. This is one level. The second level is that what we notice in practice is that there is a very pragmatic way of seeing it. When local governments are pushing a trend, for example, with this climate and the COP26, because there was a statement to be made. So there's a lot of acceptance to local governments. But in the same time, when it comes to pushing some agenda points, when it is not really meeting some national governments, you have really friction between national governments and even local governments belonging to different networks, but really advocating for a different. So you see that friction, and then you see the card of sovereignty really played sometimes. So there's a pragmatism when it comes to partnering together, but also there's a frictions when the interests are not there. And the question is that in which way we can create this line of negotiation where local government and national government will be able to accept each other, even if they can belong to the same, the same sphere. It is something that we are working on it, because again, it is, as long as cities are really an old system, but because of national state and because of the relation. So you see that there is really a lot of advocacy from the local government to find that space. And on that, there are sometimes confrontation there, and we see that. International development, particularly when there's programs of international development funded by donors. And donors now, with the proximity and with outreach and the grassroots, impact, etc. So the local governments are the first to be considered as partners in programs of national development. And sometimes in my practice, that some governments really would not allow that, national governments. And then you see that even international development trends are sometimes pushed back by national government, not recognizing local government to be really beneficiaries or partners there. And this is something what our network, for example, national network, is trying to recognize an international, into brackets, identity to some partners to be able to receive funds. It's quite complicated, so I cannot tell you that it is always smooth or it's not. So it really depends on so many parameters, but the understanding on local government seen from an angle of partners and or equal, that has the right to really express their voices and to be respected in that, I think that will be a very good basis for this trend to create more balance instead of really frictions and even confrontation.
Thank you so much. Barbara and then Boris.
So the question whether it's all good, the ascent of cities in the field of international law. No, I think the answer should be not per definition. The moment that cities make the same mistakes as national government, the moment that cities act more as corporations than for the public good, then of course this impacts negatively on whatever international tasks they could possibly take on. There's different dimensions to this. One of the things that I find disconcerting is the differences between local authorities. The book is about cities, so we speak about cities here, but one of the realities of this is that the more responsibilities local authorities get and the more they take on, the more this also applies to all local authorities, and the more you'll see differences, for instance, between rural and urban areas with a lot of money, areas with little money. And I think we see that very much in our research. Not to say that it's only cities who take on, for instance, human rights obligations, are welcoming towards refugees. Sometimes it's the smallest hamlets that do the most. I wanted to pick up on the point made by Nila on the status of local authorities within different constitutional dispensations, because one of the surprises to me in our research has been that how much local authorities do where it comes to international refugee reception, if you wish, does not depend so much on their formal competences. So for instance, Turkey, which is super centralist, where local authorities have a responsibility for garbage and not much more, do not have funds for this topic, you still see local authorities and cities really taking up a large de facto responsibility in this field. And then indeed, as you say, needing funding and, for instance, creating NGOs as local authorities in order to receive funding. So all kind of legal maneuvering out there. So just to answer the question, all good, most definitely not. With people and cities moving ahead, other cities stay behind, with consequences for those who live in them. So this is something, I think, one reason to really, the moment that, for instance, international human rights law is explicitly made relevant to the local level, to then also do it wholesale and to also speak about accountability much more often than happens now, and issues of responsibility.
Thank you. This is certainly also a very important topic, also covered in the book, I might add, in the chapter by Katja Kreutz. She has some suggestions in this regard. And Boris, please.
Thank you very much. First of all, I will react very quickly on the let's say legal position or interplay between the local and national and let's say international law. We probably should mention, at least fleetingly, that local governments are also legislators in their own right. Very often they can adopt local ordinances which have a binding character in their territory. And also many regions. We have actually fully fledged legislative regions in Europe. Some of them are quasi-legislative regions. So the legal aspects are also there present in this aspect. Having said that, and reacting now to the final question of, is anybody left behind in this whole process? Local and regional governments, not only cities, we call them local and regional governments, are not a homogeneous constituency. Of course, through increased urbanization, we see the increased importance and relevance of cities, but there is real diversity based on the national context, the competencies, the financing, the legal framework, the capacities, human resources, financial resources, political will, what we call at the local level. This makes big differences between municipalities, not only in size. Some cities or some local governments are at the forefront. Definitely, we have really flagships, front runners. As an example, I could say, for example, on the 2030 agenda, we have cities that have adopted their own indicators about the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. We have cities that undertake voluntary local reviews and are having hard time convincing the national government. I want to go to New York. I want to the high political level meeting at the UN and present my voluntary local review about the SDGs. And that's not always possible. Some countries allow mayors, presidents of regions to join the national delegation and join the UN accreditation. In some countries, this is not possible. So there are differences as well. And also the municipal fragmentation in different countries is really a very important factor. Just as illustrating example, in France, we have 36,000 municipalities, in Spain, 8,000. So you can see the, let's say, the difference, or the example of Ukraine, who through amalgamation transformed 11,000 municipalities into 1,500 municipalities. So imagine the relative power of financial, political, economic, and also the capacities of different municipalities. We see two important elements here to leave, as we say, not only no one behind, but to leave no place behind. That's also something that we say as representative organization. We are trying to encourage national governments to help their local government system. For example, in the international cooperation in France, there is an established system to support international action, internationalization of local governments. In Spain, there is a master plan for development cooperation, which includes in the table local governments or their associations. In some countries, cities and regions really have to turn to their networks, to their associations, who represent their own constituency and who try to assure these participatory mechanisms. That means invite everybody, all types of municipalities, to work not only for big cities, but to small cities, build capacities of the front runners, but also build capacities of those who are lagging behind. So this is probably the answer to this question.
Thank you very much, Boris. This brings us to the end of a very rich panel, I think. Mia, we only got to you once, but maybe it's actually possible to copy and save the questions from the chat and to share them later on the panel so that we can follow up bilaterally. You have all registered, so we know who you are and we know how to get to you, and then we can distribute these questions amongst us so that they are not lost, and we will do our best to follow up. Thank you very much, everyone on the panel. That was very rich. Thank you also, Mia. Thank you, everyone else. And I hand over to Janne for some concluding remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helmut. And thank you all for indeed a very, very rich discussion. I have all kinds of notes made. I would love to respond to all of you, but that's not my task today. But let me say that if we return to our question for tonight, reshaping global governance and international law, our cities and their networks doing that, I think I hear a yes and no. I hear about continuities and maybe new developments. It was wonderful to hear a sort of historical perspective coming from Boris and Naila, saying this is something that has been going on for quite a while. Yet there is a proliferation of international activities and networks of cities around the globe. Competition, I was happy to see in the discussion, the friction, the competition, the questions that come with politics and that come with interactions and dynamics that we know from states were also on the table today with the discussions around cities. As Barbara was saying, well, it's not all good by definition. Initially, I think many of us came to this development with the idea, oh, national politics is failing, then cities will tackle climate change, will respond to human rights violations. It's also where I was coming from. I was happy to hear, Andrea, you refer to our book about the relationship between domestic and international audits. At that time that I read a little newspaper around a clip around Kyoto, and we discussed how there's something happening there. So I hear in a way that idea that city networks were there for the last 100 years, maybe even a couple of centuries. And at the same time, there is something new happening that is coming to sight. There is someone who said, we see it happening, this changing relationship between cities and international law and international institutions. And we hope that the book assists us all in studying that relationship, understanding that relationship, together with those of you. It was super to have you here today working in those city networks, because that's where actually the practices of international law are also nurtured. And I think that's very helpful also about the comments, Andre, you made as an international lawyer, saying, okay, these practices also help to learn us something about international law. And that has been indeed the experiences we had with the seminars that Barbara referred to as authors, but also more generally, I think, in discussion around this book. So good to see also the frictions on the table, the complications of the politics of this all, and all that said, I think you raised more questions than we answered at this event. But also, I'm happy to say that in all the chapters of the handbook, our authors have pointed to the need for more research and given directions and pointers for new research, which we all hope will sort of enlarge the community of scholars and colleagues and practitioners that work on this topic. So on that note, I hope this is the beginning of a conversation also with you as people working with the city networks, with the mayors. Not the end, it's the launch of a book, but also the continuation of this conversation. So again, thank you so much for this. Allow me to thank also our team here at the Asser Institute, because obviously, as you know, we had hoped to be here in the Institute and had all things ready for that. But Floris, Leah, and Maria have done a wonderful job organizing and reorganizing. So a big thank you to them. Thank you to all the authors. Again, it has been a wonderful research project, and thank you to the speakers. And I hope to say à bientôt, because we continue on the topic. So thank you so much.
À très bientôt, Jan.
And thanks to you.
À bientôt. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.